Whenever I see anything in the Bible about plunder, one of the first things that comes to mind is that we don't really do a lot of that anymore. What are the plunder scenarios that we might encounter, most of us in the world at this point? Maybe Black Friday, doorbuster sales. That sort of feels plundery. Everybody stampeding each other to go and get a 80-inch TV that's going to burn out in 6 months anyway, one day after the extended warranty expires. Maybe you've got looting, riots and things like that. When times get crazy, you'll see floods of people with hoods up and masks on run in and grab whatever they want to grab at a place. Maybe that's kind of plundering. Maybe when somebody dies, that feels a little plundery. It's not exactly the same, but it maybe takes us to the same place morally. Somebody dies and then a family acts all tacky. I've seen a few instances where a family member rushes in right after death and is grabbing things while the body of grandma is still over there in the other room. Yuck. But for the most part, most of us are not going to be involved in a military escapade where we go and fight our enemies, and the promise is that we will be paid in plunder. So if you win, I'm not going to give you like a check or anything. We don't do that. But instead, you bring one of those really, really big backpacks and just come ready, because if you win, the game is afoot. Just run into every building and rip up rugs and look for secret compartments under the floor and find all the troves and hordes of the coins and just get anything that you can of value. Just go absolutely bonkers, go crazy, have your fun, and that's how you're going to get paid. Now, understandably, these are some of the most chaotic scenes when this stuff happens that we read about in the ancient world and the classical world. In the Middle Ages, plunder isn't as much of a thing anymore, though recently we have seen some people with a pretty Bronze Age mentality go and act in this style again. But plunder is savage, bro. That's what I'm saying. It's kind of all bets are off, morally dead zone where stuff just happens for a little while. And you would expect that if an edict goes out from a king in the ancient world, say Persia, for example, and that edict says you get to kill everybody on a given day, we're going to have a big fight, there's a scheduled fight, you would assume that everybody's going to be plundering. And in fact, when we look at the edicts in Esther, the two dueling edicts, one from the Jafar-like Haman and the other from the heroic Mordecai, they both have a provision for plunder right there in the edict. And presumably that was enough to motivate some who were on the fence with the initial edict to be like, I'll go out and I'll kill some people for that. I'd like the opportunity to plunder. You don't get that opportunity very often, and especially not without a lot of travel. I mean, I could just plunder my neighbor's house. He has tons of cool stuff that I would like. So the idea was this will motivate people and it'll rally a whole bunch of people to go and participate in this day of great evil. Mordecai's edict reverses every single thing, as we've discussed many times, from that initial edict of Haman, and so it includes a provision for plunder as well. No surprise. But when you look at all of that in the larger context of the Old Testament, it does raise a question, because plunder's a buzzword. And for the original audience who would have been reading this book and they're already very familiar with the rest of the story of Hebrew history, Jewish history, all of that stuff, they're going to see what's happening in Esther. Esther feels like it's shaping up to the original audience, like it's going to be a righting of the wrong, a correction of the ancient mistakes of the first king of the Israelites, Saul. And Saul, of course, famously didn't obey God's command to completely defeat the Amalekites and to kill the king and to kill them all. And it's a terrifying notion, this idea of ancient holy war. And it's even more terrifying in a way if you assume, as I do, that the one actual true God was behind this. Well, that situation lingers and lingers and lingers in the original audience of Esther, encounters all of this stuff, and they're thinking, okay, this kind of rhymes with that story. This feels like the historical resolution, the sequel to all of that, the decisive third round, the rubber match between the Amalekites and the Jewish people, and then the word plunder comes up. Well, plunder was going to pop off the page for them because plunder was one of the key issues that was at hand in the first place in the fight 600 years earlier between Saul and Agag of the Amalekites. You see, there are two different kinds of fights that we get throughout the Old Testament. Again, the Old Testament's covering, I guess, if you go way back, what we'd call the Stone Age, it's covering the Bronze Age, it's covering the Iron Age. But in all of these ages, plunder's part of the deal. And throughout the biblical narrative, sometimes it looks like there's a green light for plunder. Hey, go get them. This is how we're going to pay the bills. You are in a political dispute with your neighbor or whatever, and the text is more or less just silent. And if the text is silent, you can take that as a green check mark next to plunder in terms of the marching orders for this particular fight. That means, well, sure, obviously, of course. I mean, you're in a war with people in the ancient world. If you win, I mean, they're not going to need it anymore. It's dark, but I mean, it's human history. It's pretty gritty. It is what it is. So if we don't hear anything about don't plunder, we just have to assume that that's a conflict in the Bible where plunder probably happened, and that enriched the victors, as was the case with literally every other people group in the entire world, in the ancient world. And that's an important note to remember, by the way, whenever we talk about these things. Literally everyone operated by that rule of go ahead and plunder all of the time. But there's one exception to that, and it's the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the Israelites. Because every now and then they get told explicitly, don't plunder. When they look down the marching orders and they look at plunder, there's a red X next to it. And this seems to correspond with overtly holy war stuff, where the idea seems to be that God isn't interested in having the motivations of his people for these most drastic of fights looking like it was simply financial. And so by doing a thing no one would ever do, turning your nose up at the plunder, well, this is part of the message that is being sent to the other nations, the other people in the ancient world. And this is very much speaking the language of the time. Raiding, fighting, killing, plundering. This is kind of business as usual back then. But to just have that plunder sitting there and decline? Huh? Well, where to go? Who gets it then? Well, sometimes in the Old Testament, as is the case at the Battle of Jericho, something that the way it miraculously plays out is clearly held out as a holy war of conquest, almost everybody acknowledges the marching orders and say, there's a red X next to plunder, don't take anything. But there's one guy, his name's Achan, and he's like, I'll just take a little bit of stuff. It's not like anybody's going to know anyway, which is kind of dumb on his part when you think about it, because if there's a God who was attentive enough to the situation to make your marching and yelling and horns and stuff knock down super tall, thick walls miraculously, he can probably see you rifling through people's stuff and sneaking a little bit under your jacket. So I don't know what he was thinking, but he did it. And then the Israelites famously lose their next battle to the king of Ai, and the whole thing gets sorted out, and it's a very violent sorting out. But it's very, very clear by the way the story unfolds there in the book of Joshua, chapter 7-ish, that this is not to be what it is. This isn't another normal war. This isn't business as usual. Now, I suppose that God could have been like, I want to reveal myself to the nations in 1250 BC, but I don't want people later on to read it and think that I was being mean or that I just look bad. So I'm going to reveal myself to the people of 1250 BC with like 2025 Western social sensibilities. And sure, people in 1250 BC, they might not exactly get it, but I'm going to look awesome a few thousand years from now on college campuses when people are reading through my material. No, it's just, that isn't the way we see God acting. He seems to speak the language of whoever he is talking to at a given time, and the stuff that happens in the Bible makes sense to the people who are there on screen when it actually happens. I'm looking at the clock here. I have avoided this more with the Esther series we've done here. I've avoided splitting things into two, but I just want to stay on this line of thought. So I'm just going to split it into two. We're going to pick up right where we left off and talk more about the plundered thing or lack thereof and what that would have meant to the original Jewish audience and the original not Jewish audience tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.